Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ saranang gacchami, Dhammang saranang gacchami, Sanghang saranang gacchami. Dutiyampi Buddhaṃ saranang gacchami, Dutiyampi Dhammang saranang gacchami, Dutiyampi Sanghang saranang gacchami. Tatiyampi Buddhaṃ saranang gacchami, Tatiyampi Dhammang saranang gacchami, Tatiyampi Sanghang saranang gacchami. So nice to see everybody here today. Some old friends and a couple of new friends too. And had our first little bit of excitement with the internet. Kind of, it seems really simple. It's like, you just have to like press the blue button and it kind of goes. But then with technology, kind of never know, sometimes start doing something and what we'd originally tried with the original plan doesn't work. And oftentimes the kind of solution is just to kind of shut the thing down, and turn it back on. It's actually surprising how much that works. Kind of like 60% of the technology bloopers that one has seem to get resolved by turning the device off and turning it back on again. And, sometimes, meditation or kind of our life can be a bit like this too, So oftentimes, there's this tendency in the West, there's this kind of, there's a real strength in the West for kind of thinking about things. It's kind of this ability to rationally determine what the right course of action would be. And I actually remember a really good story that was told about one of the ways that this kind of really took root in the West. And this was actually in ancient Greece. And they were getting invaded by, they made this movie 300 where kind of 300 warriors held off the Persians. And in that movie, the Athenians come off looking really bad. But in actual fact, the Athenians really did quite a lot of work fighting off the Persians. And one of the big victories they had was this Persian army was immense. It was this huge army. And I can't remember the king's, I think his name was Xerxes, the king of Persia at that time, who was invading. They had this huge empire spanning all around Iran and wanted to expand it into Greece. And so Xerxes came to Greece with just an enormous, huge army and lots of ships, lots of all these other things. And there's basically no way that by numbers the Athenians could defeat the Persian army. But over time they'd kind of developed this culture of philosophy, and they'd elevated this one aspect of philosophy they called logos, it's kind of which is logic. I can't remember what it actually meant to them. It had a connotation of logic, but a lot of these things that we think of as just mental things, they had a religious aspect to them for the ancient Greeks. And so the Greeks thought to themselves, we can't win this battle. What we'll do is we'll go over to this island, which I think was called Salamis. So I don't know if that has any link with actual salami, but they had this island called Salamis. And they went over to this island and they said, okay, we'll let the Persians come and we'll abandon the city of Athens. And the Persians can come into Athens and they can loot Athens as much as they like. But the thing about this island of Salamis, I think it had it was like ringed, something like that. So you to get in, all your ships had to be kind of they had to go into this very narrow passage. So what happened is after the Persians went to Athens and kind of looted it and desecrated the holiest shrines in Athens, and I think they did some damage to some of the most valued Greek places there, the kind of Parthenon maybe, and these kind of things. I think they burned parts of it. After that, they turned their attention to Salamis, where all the Greek people were, the Athenians were. And so they got in their ships and they went into this kind of enclosure in Salamis, and all their ships went in there, but they had so many ships, they kept going in, and their ships got jammed. So then the Greek army came in with their ships from the outside, and they basically, the Persian army being jammed in this little enclosure, they were able to wipe out their fleet. And that kind of, I think, spelled the end of the Persian invasion. And I don't even know if the Persian Empire did that well after that, kind of. But this was something that kind of set this principle of logic, I think, from what I understand, very firmly in the Greek mind. That's because they were completely able to overrun this superior force by restraining their emotions. In other words, emotionally, the Persians are coming, let's dig in and strike back and attack, The Persians are going to desecrate, our most terrible, our best, our most worshipped shrines. This is the city of Athens, the city of the goddess Athena. We have these kind of temples in it, and they're going to destroy them. And through the use of logic, thinking, okay, we'll set this trap, they restrained their emotions, and they were able to overcome a much larger force, and kind of destroy the Persian army. Of course, there's kind of lessons in this. And this kind of aspect of logic, this kind of got lodged somewhat in the Western mind. It's kind of Greek philosophers through Greece. It went to Rome. The Romans kind of, they were a superior military force, but they took over Greece, and Greece was a much more highly developed kind of culture. And so they adopted a lot of the Greek ideas. We have this kind of Greco-Roman. That's where you get this word Greco-Roman. And then after the fall of the Roman Empire, there was a time of the Renaissance when people started to, I think, revisit some of these kind of ancient philosophers. Literacy got wiped out of Europe after Western Rome got destroyed by the barbarians. There was this time of Renaissance when they went back, started to recover some of the intellectual history of the West. And then through that, there was this one philosopher, Aristotle, who actually, there was a time when Christianity came to totally dominate the Western intellectual landscape. And even then, Aristotle was he was really taught in these kind of Christian universities, I think. Most of the universities were based around Christianity. And Aristotle became kind of central there. And he was the kind of first person who laid the groundwork for, maybe not the first, but he kind of became very famous for laying the groundwork for what we might call the scientific method, the scientific principle. He went around classifying all these plants. And he actually came up with the foundations for the system of logic that led to computers. It was just this kind of totally useless thing, like not all dogs are, I can't remember some of the things he talked about. You remember, Mama, kind of Doug would, kind of like, if all dogs are white, then all, something like that. I can't remember. All these kind of like, these kind of like games for philosophy. And that was the basis for computing. It had no real practical use. And so then after time, these kind of people came to, in Europe, there was this kind of gentry class, especially in Northern Europe, and they came to kind of question some of the tenets of Christianity. This kind of, and this what led to the kind of European Enlightenment. In other words, kind of throwing off the shackles of superstition, kind of just blind faith, and instead relying on logos, logic. And this kind of reliance on logic led to amazing discoveries. It kind of overturned centuries-held beliefs, overturned kind of things that people have been clinging to for a long time, and increased the wealth of Europe beyond any nation possibly in recorded history, or any area in recorded history. So one of the main things that they did, not to make this a history lesson, but they actually enshrined change into their paradigm through the PhD system. And so actually people who are at the center of European culture at that time, they were required to come up with something new. Yeah? This is where this idea of progress came from, kind of moving forward. So actually now some of these ideas get taken for granted. Our society will always be moving forward into Star Trek and will be teleporting, but previously most societies were backwards looking. And at the center of all this again was kind of a logos, It's kind of logic. It's kind of this idea that if we think about something, if we know it, if we can reduce it to first principles, then it's possible to manipulate it. It's possible to know the causes and effects that go into something, and it's possible to then manipulate those causes to get the effects. And so all these things coming together is what led to the comforts that we see in the West today. Yeah? Not just the West, everywhere now. I mean, this culture is now spread. It's global. Science, this kind of what you might call the scientific philosophy, the philosophy of logos, is actually the dominant way that people look at the world all over the world. This is a completely, almost unchallenged worldview that's enjoyed unparalleled success. No religion in history has ever had the influence that the philosophy of science has had. It's the most dominant system of thought in world history. And it's now global. It's all over the world. And of course, there are many excellent things that come from this, that come from science. You know, it's actually a really good thing to have. Good thing to have, kind of, these heaters that we don't need to go down and stoke the fireplace. It's nice to have cars, so we don't need to hop on horseback in this kind of freezing weather and ride through forests. It's nice to have airplanes so that you can travel. Actually, people travel all over the world now, I don't know how many Canadians are left during the winter some days. People go to other countries. All these things are the kind of benefits of science, benefits of logos, the benefits of logic. And one of the kind of side effects of this is that not knowing this kind of history, this kind of idea that the solution to every problem can be found solely through thinking about the problem gets embedded in our head. Not knowing that the scientific worldview is a worldview. Not all of it has been totally proven. Some of it is assumption. Some of it is theory. This is not to knock science. Science is excellent. But this is the way worldviews work. Right? It's not infallible. And these kind of views become much, much, much more powerful when we don't know they're there. So in the Western Europe, God got replaced by science, and at the center of science is logic. It's kind of a rational thinking. Now this is not an attack on rational thinking. Rational thinking is very good. But one of the things is that this becomes so unquestioned that every single problem that comes into the life of a person who's been educated in the West is approached through logic. This is, again, not necessarily a bad thing. There are many problems that can be solved through thinking about them. What's the right solution to this? What's the wrong solution to this? How can I move forward in this? And indeed, this is a big part of our meditation practice. At the end of our meditation sessions, we usually think back over the last session to see what we did well, to see what we did poorly. But like any quality, this quality of logic, this quality of thinking about things has a point where it's good, 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 and it has a tipping point where it starts to produce problems. So this is one of the things. There are actually problems that occur in our life that not only are not solved by logic, trying to think about them over and over and over again actually makes that problem worse. And this can be the case with many of the mental or emotional difficulties that come up in a person's life. So again, there's many excellent things. The science of the mind in the West, which is, again, produces many good things. But one of the things, the theories that there's many theories about psychological theories, as I understand, by the way. But one of them that got started with Sigmund Freud was that basically, I think the mind is, of my understanding, is that the mind has these kind of like containers or kind of levels. So in other words, we submit that's one of the things. The other one is that just the same way as in science, if we can figure out the first cause of something, then we can manipulate its further effects. If we can just figure out the first cause of whatever it is that's making us suffer, then we'll be able to stop it. And this is where it's seen as kind of like some of these epiphanies people have about their character, kind of these kind of epiphanies. So this is one of the reasons originally kind of people's approach to their mental difficulties was to go to somebody and to seek what they call analysis, In other words, that person would listen to you for a long time, whatever the problems were that were going on in your life. Again, not necessarily a bad thing. There's kind of a lot of good in this. But they would listen to you for a long time and come up with an analysis of where this problem comes from. And if we study the history of these things, there's a lot of interesting things. For one thing, in the West, it's often assumed that there's no such thing as rebirth. So there's nothing beyond this. So all the analyses of where a person's problems tend to lie come from really early in their childhood. In other words, I'm this way because when I was a kid, and some of them can get kind of funky. I think they're kind of even a little bit spoofy. When I was a kid, my mother or father said this to me, and that led to this, and this, and this, and this, and now I'm this way. And the idea is that if we can just dig out this truth logically, once we've released it, then the problem will be gone as well. Now, as we mentioned, there is a certain truth to this, that it's good to know where one's kind of bad habits are. It's good to know logic. But the tricky thing about the mind is that thinking about things is not objective. It's subjective. This is another action of the mind itself. In other words, we're not like detached scientists on our own mind where what we think about, what we talk about has no effect. If we're a scientist just watching a plant, okay, that plant you can kind of watch. But with our mind, what we think about is a cause for further thinking in our mind. In other words, you can't, when we try to think logically about our problems, think logically about where it comes from, this in itself is another thing that we're putting in the mind, another type of kamma. So what this means is that some of the mental problems, some of the mental difficulties we face can actually be exacerbated by thinking. In other words, we have something terrible that happened to us in our past, something bad, the memory comes up. If, in some cases, if we go thinking about that all the time, analyzing it, where did this memory come from? Why is it here? Why am I like this? Why are other people like this? What this does is creates an inclination in our mind to think about that. We're creating a momentum in our mind to go back to that problem. And when we create this momentum, what that builds is a perception in our mind. In other words, this perception of this problem fills our world. Sometimes. There are some problems like this. The more we think about them, the more they fill our world. The more they fill our mind. The more we try to think about the causes behind them, the more causes sometimes we come up with. Kind of doesn't end. So this is why it's good in our meditation practice when we have these various problems to know that there are instances where logic, okay, wait a minute here, this technology isn't working logically. Okay, the program has this blue button. What's this and this and this? I should press this and it should work. Kind of press it and it still says starting live video, still going. And so you can shut it down and restart. And so sometimes it's better to have our mind kind of in a mode where we reset it. Some problems are solved by thinking about them logically. Others are solved by having our mind in this kind of reset mode, I guess you could call it. In other words, there's an aspect of our mind that's logical, but there's also another aspect that's intuitive. And both of these are skills we have to have. This intuitive aspect of the mind, they actually wrote this interesting book on this kind of thing. It was called Blink, that I read many years back. I don't know if it's might have done more research since then. This really interesting thing where some people just look at something and have this kind of impression. And this kind of impression ends up being correct. Like in an instant, like a millisecond. So one of the examples they gave in that book, there was this kind of Greek statue. Again, I'm kind of seeing Greek people, Greeks keep coming up in this this discussion today. But there was this Greek statue that got sold to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, I think, in New York. And everything about it looked perfect. So they sold it for like millions of bucks. And there's forgeries in art on the art market. There's kind of these particular type of statue. And so all the art experts who examined this statue logically looked at all of its features, saw all of its features, were like, this is genuine. I can't see anything about this statue that's wrong with it. But then there was one art expert they took it to, and they looked at it and they're like, well, I hope that this person can get a refund for their money. And they didn't know why. They're like, I can't place why. There's something wrong with this statue. Anyways, as it turned out, after thinking about it, they just knew something was up. All this thinking the other people did, they didn't get it. This person kind of looked, they knew something was up. And later on, it came to them, wait a minute. This statue should have been in the ground for like 1,000 years. It should be really dirty. But the statue is pretty clean. All the features on it were perfect, but it was missing dirt. There was no dirt in any of the pocks. Even if you clean some of these statues, I guess, they should have little pieces of dirt in them, the ones that are genuine. And so that turned out to be true. This statue is a forgery, and the Museum of Art lost their $1 million. I don't know if they got a refund or caught the person, actually. I shouldn't say that. Maybe they tracked them down afterwards and they got their refund. But anyways, the interesting thing about it was that this person knew without knowing why. So this is actually a faculty that we can cultivate for ourselves. This kind of intuitive faculty. So often, they say when people have a problem, okay, sleep on it, In other words, don't try to solve the problem right away. Go and take a nap. When you wake up, the problem sometimes the solution presents itself to you. And similarly, we cultivate something similar with our meditation, like there when we just ask, okay, just pose the question in our mind, where would be a really good place to breathe from right now? This is something we think about logically. Let me go through all the spots in my body. Which one is good, We don't map a square chart of our body and go through every individual axis. Somehow when we pose this kind of question in our mind, awareness just goes to the spot that's actually comfortable. And it's amazing the way that this works. So there was actually a really famous meditation master in Thailand whose name was Ajahn Lee. And whenever he had a problem in his meditation he couldn't solve, because you're not always around skilled teachers, what he would do is he would pose a question in his mind, and then he would sit down to meditate. And he would just meditate. And then sometimes during his meditation, the answer would come. And then sometimes when he left, he would go back to trying to solve this problem. And sometimes you get the right answer. In other words, there's no guarantee that that will be the right answer, but sometimes it's a lot better when our mind is kind of still. So sometimes thinking can be like this. It's like having this kind of... I remember before, being in Ontario, I used to like to scuba dive or, go snorkeling a lot. And there was this period when I was young when the water in the lakes in Ontario was very murky. Like you could barely see, It was kind of all this silt was just always stirred up in all the Ontario lakes I went to, And then there came this time when I was a teenager, there was this kind of like invasion by zebra mussels. Does anybody remember that? They had all these zebra mussels, and they came from the Caribbean, and there was nothing that knew how to eat them. And they filtered all the water. So all of a sudden, for a long period of time in Ontario, you could see like right to the bottom of like a lot of these, they started looking like the Bahamas. Now I think that something figured out how to eat them, and so the water's back to normal. But this is the way it is. When there's not a lot of silt stirred up in the water, sometimes you can see to the bottom a lot more clearly. And it's the same thing. Sometimes if there's a particular problem, okay, we've tried to think it out logically and nothing's happening, then sometimes a solution to that is to let the mind settle down. When the mind is settled, you can see further to the bottom. Sometimes these things just come floating up. This is a solution. And also sometimes things just solve themselves. A problem that seemed really intractable, well, I don't really know what to do about this, I'm not too sure. Sometimes it just goes away. And we just let things be. This is also another good practice to cultivate. There's this kind of a story about, again, the British. and World War II. And I think this was another time that they were fighting the Japanese. And the Japanese had a huge force. And the British just had this really tiny force, you know. And so they were about to get overrun by these Japanese. And the Japanese didn't know they were there, but the army was kind of approaching, you know. And so like, what should we do? So some of the young soldiers were like, let's go out and let's go out in a blaze of glory, you know, like kind of Lord of the Rings, and they kind of go out, there's just a few of them, and they fight to the end. And then other people were like, okay, no, you know, let's go bargain with them, you know. And so the commander said, okay, well, we're British, so let's have some tea. So they stopped, and they had some tea. And I think they didn't know what to do after that, so they had more tea. And eventually, by the time they'd finished all their tea, the Japanese army had passed by. In other words, that problem kind of solved itself. So in other words, the things that arise in our mind are actually like this too. You know? Some of them can and are adequately solved through logic. But there are many, many problems. Actually, logic can cause its own problems through overthinking about things. We create this kind of stir in our minds, where our mind becomes very cloudy, just more and more thinking, more and more thinking. What do I do? What do I do? What do I do? What do I do? This is very kind of blurry quality. And if this is the case, then the solution to some of these kind of problems is just to let the mind settle down. You know? In other words, if there's a problem we can't solve, okay, I can't solve it now, I'll just let it be. In the future, that solution might come to me. Mm-hmm. And we can practice meditation, continue to practice meditation as we were, and our mind becomes calm. When we allow our mind to become calm, sometimes we can see more deeply to the bottom. And sometimes in just waiting for these problems to solve themselves, not knowing what to do, they pass on their own. Yeah? So in other words, logic, this kind of a faculty of logos, it is something very important. It's something very good to have in our practice. But also this faculty of kind of intuition is something we could cultivate, you know? It's like somebody who goes to the gym and works out but just has a really buff right arm. There was this movie, again, a kind of movie, Lady in the Water. This guy just kind of kept working out his right side, his really huge right arm, a really tiny left one. So we don't want to be like that. So we learn to lift both with our right and our left arm. So we learn to make our logical faculty strong and our intuitive faculty strong. And in this way, we become a more kind of balanced person, you know? A person who has a set of skills that are applicable to the problems that arise in our meditation, to the problems that arise in our life, a person who has the skills to make themselves happy.